it's really to make the point that, I mean, the moment that we are born, our lives take flight. And the moment we are in flight, we are all, without exception, eventually destined to land. And so we're going to be talking about, what are the challenges of being in flight, knowing that all of us are destined for landing, that is, grappling with issues related to mortality. So what is the path then that led me to kind of discover that dignity? And that's, some people have accused me of having kind of a dignity perseveration. It has been an important area of study, not the exclusive area of study, but an important area of study. Why so? Why does dignity matter? Not just to me, but why ought it to matter to you and to your patients and families as we try and guide them through end-of-life circumstances? Well, for me, it begins back in, well, I'll start the story in New York City. We don't have to begin with my birth, but we'll start in New York City when my life took flight. This is a photograph of Dr. Jimmy Holland and her kind of protege, Dr. William Breitbart. So Jimmy Holland was a psychiatrist living in New York City, working at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and she started the first psycho-oncology service located in a very large major cancer center. And when I became interested in the interface between psychiatry and cancer, or people who were dealing with life-threatening, life-limiting conditions, I went to the head of our Cancer Foundation and said, I'm really kind of interested in exploring this. His name was Lionel Israels. He was a very formal, serious biological scientist. He was interested in hemoglobin. I don't think he had too much concern about psychiatrists or things of a psychiatric nature, but he gave me the name of the only psychiatrist that I'm sure that he could invoke, and that was Jimmy Holland, and said, well, if you're really serious about this, you ought to go off to New York and hang out with her and find out, what this is about, which I did. I went there and then got offered a fellowship and completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology and returned to Winnipeg, where I began a service for patients and families that continues to exist today. And also met, extraordinary people, including William Breitbart, who, as I said, is kind of Jimmy Holland's protege. For those of you who are familiar with the psycho-oncology literature, you'll know the name William Breitbart. He's the head of the Department of Psychiatry at Sloan Kettering, and he also is the editor of the journal Palliative and Supportive Care. So that was the beginnings of my entry into this area of trying to explore the interface between the illness and kind of what I kind of think of as the experiential landscape of end-of-life care. Now, I already mentioned Dame Cicely Saunders, and I had the very lovely opportunity and privilege of meeting with Dame Cicely Saunders. Again, this goes back many moons when I had, so much more hair than I do now. Extraordinary. She was a really interesting person. She had trained as a social worker, as a nurse, and then qualified as a physician with the mandate that this would, kind of enable her to be able to be more attentive to the needs of dying patients and families. And just like her disciplinary perspectives, I think her ideological perspective was also kind of multifaceted. That is, to do good, comprehensive, quality, end-of-life care, one needed to be attentive to the psychosocial, the existential, the spiritual, the physical, and that you couldn't do one without the other, at the risk of not providing exemplary care. I was going to say that that she also was the founder of palliative care, and well, in some ways that is true. The term palliative care actually was coined by a Canadian physician, Balfour Mount. Some of you may have heard the name. Anyways, I was invited to London, St. Christopher's Hospice, to give a lecture, and was feeling kind of rather nervous. Because Dame Cicely Saunders is to palliative care what Mick Jagger is to rock and roll. I mean, without exaggeration. I mean, she is, kind of like the pinnacle of kind of authority and influence. And so I began to think about the things I had published and wondered, what searing, kind of eviscerating question is Dame Cicely going to ask me? And I remember I went to London, I got into a taxi that morning heading over to St. Christopher's, and I told him I was going there, and well, he had heard about Dame Cicely, which did nothing to quell my anxiety whatsoever. I remember sitting in the waiting area, feeling anxious, and there was a voice that came over the intercom after 5 or 10 minutes that said, "The Dame will see you now." Just like that. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be horrible. So I went and I sat down with Dame Cicely, my colleague Irene Higginson, again, another name that you may know. She's a very prolific palliative care researcher, but she's the one who snapped this photograph. And you can see that, I mean, neither of us are looking very unhappy, and I'm certainly looking pretty calm. The reason being that it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and the only question Dame Cicely asked me, and I'm not sure that she ever had heard of me or read any of my papers whatsoever, the only question she asked me was, "Would you care for a sherry?" And this is her liquor cabinet, and these are empty sherry glasses. And when Dame Cicely at 10 in the morning says, "Would you care for a sherry?" there is only one answer, and the answer is yes. It's a true story, by the way. So, came back to Winnipeg, started working in the Department of Psychiatry, was working at Cancer Care Manitoba, founded this kind of a Department of Psychosocial Oncology, or now called Patient and Family Support Services. And then, one day in the Department of Psychiatry, we were kind of had these literature review, weekly literature reviews that we all bring interesting papers to. And one week, somebody brought this particular paper, and it was a paper that was actually by a colleague of mine, Dr. Jim Brown, or James Brown, not the blues singer, but the psychiatrist who was an expert in mood disorders. And he had done a study in which, for the first time, had broached the question, is it ever normal for people who are facing death, a life-limiting condition, to actually covet an earlier demise, to wish for life to be over sooner than later? And by the way, you don't have to worry about anything that's on the slides. It's just meant as cues for me to be able to tell you the things that I hope to cover. All of the articles are available in the public domain. I think you all have kind of handouts if you want to kind of look at the references. This was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry back in, I think it was 1986. And when we reviewed it in Journal Club, what came out was that, this is a really interesting paper. Interesting because nobody had ever bothered to ask the question before. It was a relatively small study. I think there were 44 patients, 10 of whom it appeared had a genuine desire to die. Now again, this is decades before medical assistance in dying in Canada, decades before Supreme Court decisions changing our legislation. And we were not asking patients about the wish for euthanasia or assisted suicide. We're saying, do you feel like you would like your life to end sooner than later? And of the 10 who said they would, Jim Brown and his colleagues reported that all of them had syndromal depression. We said, well, that's really interesting. And this is not a critique of Jim Brown or the paper. Good research answers some questions and it raises others. So the questions that this answered is that, first of all, you can actually track something as ephemeral as the wish to die. I mean, that's something you can ask people about in a meaningful way. And it also seems that at least there's a strong signal that there's a relationship between the wish to no longer be here and this whole kind of entity, this construct of depression. But is that all there is to it? And again, good research answers some questions, but it raises others. So is that all that's going on? Is it the case that if you no longer want to live and you're approaching end of life, de facto you have a psychiatric disorder? Or might there be some other things going on? And we certainly suspected that there likely were. Up until this point, I had never intended to do research. I mean, I remember watching my colleagues at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I thought, you know, these folks are very impressive, but it's kind of a crazy life they're living. You know, no matter what they do, they feel like they've failed. You know, they go and see patients, and they haven't done their teaching. They go and do teaching, and they feel they haven't done their research. And they go and they do their research, and they feel, oh my God, at the end of the day, I have to run onto the ward and try and take care of all of the fires that have to be put out. And I thought, that is not going to be me. That is not a life. And then I kind of got bitten by the research bug, because I saw this paper, and our department had hired this man. His name was Keith Wilson, and he was a clinical psychologist whose job was to hassle people like me, to encourage them to do clinical research. Why? Our department head thought we were doing a lousy job of research, and if we had some good papers and some good researchers, it would elevate the profile of our department. And so Keith would hassle me, and I would try and avoid him as much as possible, until that day when we reviewed Jim Brown's paper. And I remember almost going directly from that journal club, knocking on Keith's door and says, okay, I think I have an idea. I think this would be a really interesting area to study. And I mean, more so than anyone, this man was my mentor. I mean, he essentially held my hand. We figured out how to, I mean, I had no idea how you write a grant proposal. And within, I'm sure, a month, 6 weeks of that initial meeting, we had a grant that was assembled, we got funded, and we began doing a much larger study on this notion of desire for death in the terminally ill. What did we discover? Well, we discovered that in this large cohort of dying patients, and let me just define that for a minute. So you're going to hear me talking about a lot of ideas and a lot of studies, because I mean, as much as the introduction implies I know about death, I've never died, not even once. And so we need to, I think, be reliant on empirical evidence to try and guide, how we can give exemplary care. So what did we discover from this cohort? And the nature of the cohort is less than 6 months life expectancy. That is kind of the criterion for admission to palliative care. All of these patients, well, the vast majority, about 80%, had an end-stage malignancy of some sort, and the average age was late 70s, early 80s, which essentially kind of describes the demographic of people who entered into palliative care in one of our 2 inpatient units at the time. What we found is that in half of them, they said, desire for death is not really something that's on my personal radar. I don't really think about that, which means that in the rest, at least even fleeting thoughts of no longer wanting to be alive is not atypical. And in a smaller cohort, and about just under 10% had a consistent, ardent wish that they no longer be alive. Again, decades before Carter decision, Supreme Court, decades before legislation around medical aid in dying. So what differentiates people who say, I want to be alive, versus those who say, I don't want to be alive? Well, these are the significant players. First off, we found that pain of moderate severity or greater was present amongst those who had an ardent wish to die. They also reported the perception that their families weren't as available or as supportive. And again, I have no way of validating that. We didn't have family interviews happening concurrently, but that was the perception of this cohort of people who were saying, I'm done. I'm ready for it to be over. And indeed, we did find that depression was a very significant player. About 70% of people who no longer wanted to be alive met criterion for syndromal depression, compared to only about 10% amongst those who did not want life to be over. So And again, the figures aren't so critical that you remember, but I think that the take-home message is a critical one. And that is that, I mean, part of the experience of human suffering is at times a wish that life no longer seems tenable or sustainable. And how do you enter into that space with somebody? Well, I think you enter into it with great humility, but as well with your eyes wide open. And by that I mean, you need to be aware that, and again I kind of refer to it as this kind of experiential landscape is complex. And if you're going to navigate that landscape, you need to be aware of a multitude of things. You need to know that there are things that could be happening physically, in this instance represented by pain, that can influence, the wish to go on or not. There can be things happening in that individual's surround. In other words, family support, psychosocial support, that can influence whether or not that person sees life as sustainable. And finally, the psychological, and I would add / existential, spiritual, there are elements within that domain that can undermine the wish to go on living. So no matter what area that you happen to be working in, even though we tend to kind of put these things into silos, and by necessity, because life is complex, and we like to or need to silo things in order to try and get a grip on it, to try and understand it. But what we have to understand is the only silo that exists for patients, is like within a whole person. So people experience these things in the entirety of their being. This next slide also kind of underscores that. Let me just back up to say, in some ways, if you think about it, what we've done here is used what I think of as kind of a photograph metaphor in terms of research design. And by that, I mean, this is a snapshot of what understanding desire for death looks like in cross-section. So we have these folks that we're seeing, they're all in the palliative care program. I think, I'd have to look back, I think most of them, if not all of them, were inpatients. There may have been some people who are in the community followed by the program, but nevertheless, this is a snapshot. And what we know is that these things are very dynamic. The experience of patients, if there's one thing we can count on, it's that things will change. And so rather than a photograph metaphor, we really need to use kind of a video cam metaphor. That is something that is kind of keep the camera rolling, prospective, and following it forward in time to see what does it look like. And so we then segue to a will to live study. Now, I mean, not that the thinking around that shift was not terribly sophisticated, and it went like this. We wanted to find out from people, like not only once a day, but even twice a day, how are they feeling about this whole notion of kind of going on living or not? And we thought, if we walk into a patient's room every day, twice a day, from the time they come into palliative care until the time that they're no longer able to give meaningful data, and ask them about their desire for death, they're going to want to kill us. And so we said that is not perhaps going to work. Will to live, on the other hand, is something you can ask about, and we did ask about. I'm glad that you seem amused, and I'm so delighted with that. You may be familiar, there's an instrument in palliative care called the ESAS, or the Edmonton Symptom Assessment Scale. If not, it's a very commonly used instrument in palliative care. It's not only exclusive to Canada, it's internationally used. It consists of a series of visual analog scales, and they're all anchored from 0 to 100, and they cover a multitude of end-of-life experiences. So there's a visual analog for pain and depression and dyspnea and anxiety and so on and so forth. The common experiences of people near end of life. And we added a will to live visual analog and would have patients fill out twice a day whether or not they, to what extent they felt that their desire for death was kind of intact, and they would score that on this ordinal scale. So this data, and again, this was published in the, I think the late 1990s, early 2000s in the journal The Lancet. In yellow, you can, and this is a single case example. There are, like I said, patients in this cohort. In this case example, this is a woman with end-stage colorectal cancer. In yellow is will to live. What you need to know improves. Trust me on the reverse scoring there, but the low score means her will to live has improved, and it stays improved until she is approaching death, at which time it becomes either more erratic or more erratically reported. We stop collecting data when people are no longer competent, when you can no longer, retrieve trustworthy data. What's really interesting is that you can now parse out other sources of distress and superimpose them on her experience of will to live. And what do you see? It's kind of fascinating. You see this kind of intimate tango, that will to live and pain seem to be doing this very intimate dance, so that as her will to live improves, so too does her subjective reporting of pain. And again, towards end of life, becomes more erratic, more erratically reported. We can't talk about cause and effect, but what we can say is these two things are highly correlated, extremely highly correlated. We can also then, make one of two assumptions. Either, as we are improving her pain management, her will to live improves, and that's easy to wrap our minds around. Easy to wrap our minds around, but isn't it interesting then, getting to this issue of silos? So the intervention of a pain specialist has a spiritual outcome as basic, as essential of, is life sustainable? Do you want to go on living? That's interesting. Also, it could be that now that she is in a palliative care unit, her psychosocial needs are being looked after, she's being attended to in a variety of ways and receiving supports, that it favorably alters her pain thresholds, and she's no longer reporting as much discomfort. Through the years, I have continued to be interested and intrigued by the notion of, is life sustainable? Is life tenable? And one of the things, and we'll be talking about this a little bit more, I can't remember if it's in this talk or one of the later ones, but talking about what are the things that undermine the wish for dying patients to continue to feel life is sustainable. And one of the things that we've had patients report is this notion of, I don't feel like me anymore. I don't feel like the person that I once was. And I have called that or labeled that, and this is a paper that just came out, I think it was actually earlier this year, called Fractured Personhood, Suicide, and Lessons from Those Nearing Death. And the interesting thing that I've learned over the years, from being a palliative care researcher, is that palliative care is just a vantage point. And by that, what I mean is that, it gives you a place to make observations about the human condition, but these are observations about human beings. And even though these human beings are at the end of life, it doesn't negate the importance of those observations in terms of other parts of life. So I guess, when I talk about, kindness, compassion, dignity, feeling like you're the person that you've always been, palliative care doesn't have a monopoly on those things. I mean, it happens to become very exquisitely important because of the vulnerability of that individual, but it's not exclusive to palliative care. At least that's my sense. And so this particular paper begins to explore, can we understand the dynamics of suicide across the full life cycle, using this construct of fractured personhood? Do things happen to me in life that kind of break my sense of continuity with who I am, who I feel I've always been, and my ability to continue to be that individual? And so we are now embarking on a study, not in palliative care, but in an inpatient psychiatric unit, where we're going to be talking to people who have either made a suicide attempt or have expressed suicidal ideation, and try and explore in a qualitative way whether or not this dynamic of fractured personhood is something that has relevance. You're probably wondering, when's he going to talk about dignity? We're almost there. We're almost there. This is the pathway leading to. So this is kind of the preamble, the path that led to. So eventually, during the course of doing all this work, and again, pre-Carter, pre-Supreme Court, pre-Made legislation, we became interested in finding out in jurisdictions where those options are available, how does it play out? What does it look like? And I'm referring, of course, to the Benelux countries and places like Holland that have been engaged in practices around euthanasia, which is a lethal injection causing, obviously causing the death of the patient, lethal injection, or assisted suicide, giving a prescription for a dose of drug that can be taken in overdose to end the person's life at a time of their choosing. So that's a differentiation. And we discovered there was a study that was commissioned by the Dutch government. The first author was a man named, it'll come to me, Van whatchamacallit. Van der Mast. How many times have I said the name Van der Mast? And for some reason, a little bit of a brain freeze up here. Paul Van der Mast, Dutch physician commissioned by the Dutch government to do a couple of things. One is find out the prevalence of what they refer to as MDEL, medical decisions to end life. And Van der Mast did this large epidemiologic survey in Holland, looking at how prevalent these practices were. I think the results were something in the order of magnitude 4% of Dutch people were dying as a result of euthanasia, so lethal injection, and less than 0.5% assisted suicide. And that's pretty consistent in constituencies where both is available. In fact, in Canada, it's even much more a stark contrast than that. The vast majority of people dying as a result of medical aid in dying are because of a lethal injection. It's only a small handful, so a tiny minority, that are dying as a result of a lethal overdose or assisted suicide. But none of that was as important to us as the question, why? And that's the thing that I've always found intriguing about this topic. It's not, that you kind of feel this intense interest in euthanasia-assisted suicide per se, but the path leading there, why are folks making this decision? What are the dynamics of understanding that decision-making? That's really interesting, at least I think so. And what makes it interesting? If you can understand why somebody no longer wants to be here, I'm not saying in all instances, but if you can understand why somebody no longer wants to be here, I think that can give you a better handle on understanding how to deliver better, exemplary, quality palliative care. I mean, that's my take. And so Van der Mast did us the great favor by trying to address the issue of why. Now, methodologically, this was not an easy task. You've got all of these people who have now died, and you're wanting to ask the question, if you could, why have you made this decision? What led you down that path? Well, they were very clever. They went to the death record. On the death record, it indicates, how somebody has died. And in those who died as a result of euthanasia or assisted suicide, there was a physician of record. And so they then contacted all of these Dutch physicians who had helped their patients an expedited death to find out, why do you think this happened? Why did your patient make this decision? And this is where Dignity came onto their radar, and in turn came onto my radar. Because as it turns out, according to Dutch physicians, loss of dignity was the most highly cited reason for which patients had sought out an earlier death. You can see pain alone, less than 5%. Some of these nebulous variables, tiredness of life or unworthy dying, we didn't have a definition in the paper, but nevertheless, those are the figures that were reported. Nor, by the way, did Vandermeer give the physicians an a priori definition of dignity. So, like the Brown study, this was a really good study, but it raised some really good questions. One is, well, what do you mean by dignity? I mean, we hadn't really kind of defined that. And the other thing was a much more obvious kind of methodological problem with the paper, which is the source of information. You know, if you want to find out something about somebody, you're probably not going to say, well, let's wait till somebody's dead, and then find somebody who knows them really well and say, so what do you think was going on with somebody? No, you will not get funded for that study. Take it from me. So we said, well, two things. One is, you know, if we're going to do this, we need to find out, I mean, is dignity an important thing to patients? And the second thing we said is, you know, that if dignity is worth dying for, then dignity is worth studying. Now, the first thing you do when you embark on this kind of a problem is you go to the literature. And what did we find in the literature at that time? What you find is that dignity was cited all over the place, not in any empirical sense, but it's cited in a way that, I'm almost hesitant to say this word, but it's cited as a trump card. Is it okay to say that? Okay. I'm a Canadian, so forgive my naivete. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that it is the card you pull out when you want to justify whatever the contentious position you happen to support, when there are no other arguments. So if, for example, you're on the side of the political fence that says euthanasia, assisted suicide are appropriate end-of-life choices for patients, my body, my autonomy, I get to say what happens, you pull out that card. This is a dignity issue. And if you're on the opposite side of the political fence, you say Hippocratic oath, you know, violation of patient-clinician, you know, kind of contract. This is a dignity issue. We came at it and said, you know, like, we're not the moral police. You know, we don't have a political axe to grind. The only ideology that we have is, if we get it, like if we can understand it, maybe we can do better when it comes to palliative care. That's what we felt then, and I feel that as strongly in my bones today. So we began doing some empirical studies, and these are the first studies that came out on the construct of dignity, the first studies that have reported from the vantage point of patients, what do we mean by dignity? So we approached it in a variety of ways. This first is, it's interesting, but it's relatively simplistic in that we simply said on an ordinal scale, and we modeled a dignity item based on the SADS interview, which is the Schedule of Affective Disorders and Schizophrenia. Not important. But what you're doing is having patients, and again, the same kind of patients that I've talked about in our other studies, so 6 months or less to live, vast majority cancer, somewhere in their late 70s, early 80s, to say, what is your sense of dignity? Can you just kind of rate the extent to which you feel it is intact versus not intact or broken or fractured? And what you find out is that in half of the cohort, dignity, at least occasionally, is something that is on their radar. And in a small minority, and we were actually surprised that the numbers weren't higher, but maybe it would be higher if these folks weren't receiving exemplary palliative end-of-life care. But in about under 10%, I think it was 7% of these folks had a vigorous, kind of an ardent, ongoing sense that their sense of dignity was under assault. So like the Desire for Death study, we said, well, how do you differentiate people who say, well, my dignity is intact versus my dignity is fractured or broken? No surprise, if you look at the psychological symptoms, higher desire for death, loss of will to live, depression, hopelessness, anxiety. And, you start to think, is this kind of lending empirical validity to the experiences you see coming out of Holland? Could there be a, loss of sense of dignity, ergo, loss of desire to be alive, the psychological kind of syndromes, or a constellation of symptoms, I should say, and therefore a request to have life ended, possibly. In terms of physical differentiations, there seem to be more pain, difficulty with bowel functioning, which I'll say more about in a moment, and even something as basic as how I physically appear, or how I kind of sense others are seeing me, which I'll say more about again in a moment. What we call the intimate dependencies of care: bathing, dressing, toileting. And how many of us have heard people say, if I could no longer manage, those intimacies of care, I don't know that I would want to go on living. And of course, we know that people change when they start to confront illness in a way that is adaptive and oftentimes yielding on that particular outlook. But nevertheless, in those with lost sense of dignity, intimate dependencies of care were a much more problematic issue. So this brings me to this slide, which in some ways to me is maybe one of the more significant or profound points that I want to make that we discovered on dignity from that quantitative work. And basically, what we did, we had all of these measures, quantitative measures. And so when you have that, you can put depression and anxiety and shortness of breath and family, you can put all of it into the kind of the hopper and say, well, when we start running the mathematical models, what comes out as being most predictive as to whether sense of dignity is intact or not? And wouldn't you know it, the thing that came out as the most ardent predictor of variance in dignity, the measure of dignity, was appearance, or how people kind of saw themselves, felt themselves to be seen, which is a mouthful, which is why I'll repeat it in a few different ways. This is an etching by a Dutch graphic artist, MCDES. I found it online. I think it's actually the compilation of 2 of his etchings. And I choose to think of this as dignity in the eye of the beholder, which is actually the title of an article that I published after the Lancet article on Will to Live in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And in that article, I try and make the point that metaphorically, even though this is based on empirical data, but metaphorically, patients are looking for a reflection in the eye of the healthcare provider that will be affirming of their sense of dignity. So when you look at this photograph, what do you see? I see, and this is a self-portrait of the artist, so you see a reflection in the eye of the provider that is affirming, and I think that's an important word in what we do, this idea of affirmation. It is affirming of the entirety of this individual that we see portrayed here, who is in his own clothes, in his own apartment, surrounded by his own books, his own photographs, his own pictures, as opposed to a reflection that might just include a differential diagnosis or a problem checklist. In other words, the problem, as I've written about it, is of patienthood eclipsing personhood. Or as I heard somebody referring to it the other day, this idea that we have to be really cautious about what can happen to patients standing in the shadow of their illness. And we know from our experience that illness can cast a really long and dark shadow, making it difficult for people to be seen. Okay. And by the way, just even though it sounds like I'm kind of perseverating on this, again, for me, this was really kind of an epiphany. The finding was an epiphany. And why? Because it says, the entirety of my working life, I'd always thought about good palliative care is learning about doing things to patients or with patients. And suddenly the data was saying that the most ardent predictor of sense of dignity in the work that I do has something to do with what goes on between my ears. How I see my patients, how they experience me seeing my patients profoundly shapes their illness experience. Well, isn't that wild? So I got to think about not just what's happening in the bed, what's happening in the room. I got to think about what's happening in my head. You know, what am I doing, you know, by virtue of my presence that is influencing and shaping what's going on here in their illness experience? And if you're saying, well, you're starting to sound a little bit like a secular rabbi, or, you know, this sounds like pontificating, I bring you back to, not so says I, this is the data. The data is saying that that dynamic is one of the most predictive of sense of dignity outside of anything else that you do in end-of-life care. So that leads us to grappling with the fact that our lens, you know, the healthcare provider lens, how we see our patients, is really important. So besides everything else that we do, we need to think about how we see people and what influences and shapes how we see people. And I'll be talking a whole lot more about that. Now, COVID in some ways, you know, really kind of forced us to look at some of these issues in a way that was, exquisitely important, exquisitely tragic, but it really kind of uncovered things that we probably know or should have known about, you know, what is important in end-of-life care, attending to people who are really, really sick. This is a photograph of my wife, and this is probably an image that all of you, in some ways, kind of experienced during the pandemic, because Michelle is standing outside of the room of our late cousin Joyce. Joyce died in a personal care home. She spent the last number of years of her life in this personal care home. And sadly died, you know, during the height of the pandemic. So the last few months of her life, was entirely isolated, other than the staff that was there. We weren't allowed to go in and see her. And what you can see Michelle doing is, you know, she's holding her cell phone, and off in the distance, what you can see is, and it's difficult to see Joyce, which is just exactly the point. She is there in her room. There is a healthcare aide, trust me, again, it's hard to see, but there's a healthcare aide who is trying to hand her a telephone so that we can have this conversation. And in some ways, and the reason that I include this slide is just, you know, I always hesitate to be too personally disclosing, but this is a personal disclosure that I really think highlights something that all of us went through, which is it made it more difficult to see the people that we love or the people that we were caring for. It made it impossible to touch them and to be connected in a way that we have discovered is so vital and fundamentally important in delivering good end-of-life care. So soon after the pandemic began, I, along with a couple of colleagues, published this piece in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. And the first sentence reads, if the first casualty of war is truth, the first casualty of coronavirus disease COVID-19 for patients nearing death is human dignity. Now, getting back to then the importance of human dignity and the things that we have learned about human dignity over the years, I've told you that we've done some work using kind of a quantitative approach, which is interesting, and I think the results are interesting, but in some ways kind of simplistic. And it's like saying, listen, we can take anything that's complex and put it on an ordinal scale. You know, love. 0 to 10, give me your rating and I'll just do the logistic analysis and I can explain love. We don't need Shakespeare. We don't need poetry. So, you know, that's kind of wonky. Love is kind of a nuance. There are textures and layers that you can't just quantify by trying to stick it on a scale the same way you would salami. So we have, I thought that sounded funny, by the way. I thought it sounded funny. It just came to me in this moment. I said, I think I'm going to use the word salami in the next, nanoseconds. None of this is planned, by the way. It's all extemporaneous. So we then said, well, we need to do qualitative studies. We need to go to the bedside and do these detailed interviews with patients and find out about dignity, what it means to them, when it works, when it doesn't work. And what we found, okay, just checking my time, we're doing fine. What we found was what we reported as a empirical model of dignity in the terminally ill. And this is an interesting finding. I can't tell you that this is the best model of dignity in the terminally ill or the worst, but I can say it's the only one, which makes it worth taking a moment to try and understand, what this means. It's divided into 3 parts. And again, all of this is, obtained from patients. And what patients are saying, in this model is, these are the domains of influence that have an effect on my sense of dignity. So more broadly, there are things that happen, that are directly mediated by my illness that can affect my dignity. So independence, cognitive acuity, functional capacity, symptoms. We spend a lot of time dealing with symptoms, distress of various different kinds. But it is a direct output of what the illness is doing to the patient. On the other end, we have what I call the social dignity inventory, which is to say there are things that happen outside of that individual that have an influence on their sense of dignity. So are you safeguarding their privacy? Is that counterbalanced by good social support? Care tenor is a term that we introduced that I think is, again, important, and it has, kind of a similar kind of bearing when to the what I said about this idea about our disposition. Care tenor is the tone of care. So what kind of a ambience, what kind of a meta message do we give when we walk in? I remember one time an oncology nurse who was listening to me talking about this, she said, "Oh, I call that the fragrance of care." So, what do you mean by that? She said, "Oh, it's that something, you walk in the room and it just kind of wafts through the space and it just permeates everything, giving the person a sense of, is this person here with me, for me? Do they understand? Don't they understand?" So it's those kind of tiny, kind of ephemeral nuances. Feeling a burden to others, of course, people can feel affected by the way others are attentive or not to them, and something we called aftermath concerns, which is the equivalent of burden to others, but after you have died. So what distress will my death impose on others when I am no longer here? How will my family get along without me? And then in the middle is this dignity-conserving repertoire, which really has to do with the very textured, very layered, nuanced elements of the psychological, the spiritual, the existential. And you can see that many of those, and we'll be talking more about this later on, have to do with what I refer to as personhood. Do I still feel like me? So continuity of self, feeling of pride, generativity, and that will come up later on when I introduce the whole notion of dignity therapy. Generativity, by the way, is a term that we borrowed from the developmental psychologist Erik Erikson. I know there are some psychologists in the room. Yes, there are some psychologists in the room. By the way, I should say, so how many psychologists are there in the room? Hands up. Physicians? Joel, glad you're here, representing the profession of medicine. I'll leave my strange jokes to myself. You and I will share them together. Nurses, palliative care social workers, some of whom I met last night at dinner, and I can tell you are very nice people. Pastoral care chaplains, excellent. Volunteers, OT, PT, others. Who have I missed? Therapists. Okay. Like non-psychologists, but therapists. Excellent. Fantastic. Great. I should have done that at the beginning, by the way, to sort of get a sense of, so who are these folks and where are you coming from? So you raised your hand? Administrator. Ooh. This is, suddenly I feel a little more intimidated. We are going to talk about the bottom line. We are. We are going to talk, and I'm not saying that in a facetious way. We are going to talk about the bottom line, because administrators are important in terms of understanding how resources are distributed, and those are important decisions. So generativity, I was saying, is a term we borrowed from Erik Erikson. That's right. That's how I got onto psychologist. So Erik Erikson had this really interesting way of understanding human development, and talked about there being various different tasks that we are confronted with in the course of our lives. And one of the later life developmental stages was this notion of generativity versus stagnation. So coming to a point in life where we are either investing emotional, intellectual energies into the people that will follow in our path, or stagnation, a feeling that we no longer are contributing. And the final one, which is interesting, is integrity or integration versus despair. Okay, so this is what the model of dignity looks like in the terminally ill. And what's been really interesting about this model is that it provides kind of a template. You know, you have to, a way of saying, you know, if we're going to get a handle on what dignity means, this model ought to give us some insights. Now again, people sometimes say, well, at the end of the day, so what is dignity? Say, well, I mean, the dictionary definition of dignity is about, you know, feeling worthy of honor, respect, esteem. You know, that's a good definition. But when I think about dignity, I think about, and again, many of us say that we do dignity-conserving care, or we do person-centered care. I say, well, you can't do those things if you don't understand, I mean, how to operationalize dignity. And you can't do person-centered care if you don't know who these people are. And we'll say more about that. So the interesting thing about then the model is when I try and operationalize something as nebulous as dignity, I think of this. I say, you know, it's non-hierarchical. It means different things to different people. But if we're going to understand dignity, then we need to understand that there are this kind of multiplicity of influences. And we better try and get a handle on those if we're going to move forward. Okay. So the last thing maybe I'll talk about is another area of research. And we are going to be talking a whole lot more about dignity in the next talks as we move forward. But the last thing I'll talk to you about is a particularly interesting study that we did at one point that tried to broach what are the constituents, what are the elements of good, optimal therapeutic communication. Now, if you think about trying to understand the human body, this is a famous painting by Rembrandt, the dissection. And the human body lends itself well to being understood. You know, when we do an anatomical dissection, you know, we are disentangling the various different parts, you know, trying to figure out, you know, what they look like and how they feel and what's connected to what, in order to understand, you know, the entirety of the human body, how it works. And as it turns out, I mean, understanding that anatomy, this is, you know, Leonardo da Vinci, and he very much was interested in the anatomy of the body, because in doing that, it gave him a better sense of how it works, so that when he came to painting human beings, he knew the underlying structures that needed to be addressed. Communication doesn't lend itself as well to anatomical dissection. Although what we decided to do, yes, you can laugh. I mean, you know how long it took to sit for this portrait? What we decided to do was to say, well, what happens if we treat communication the same way we would a human body and try and dissect it, try and break it down into its constituent elements? And so that's exactly what we did. And this model that you see here is the end result. And I'm not going to walk you through all of it in its entirety, but I'll just sort of give you, I think, kind of an overview of what that looks like. Because again, all of us, you know, want to be better communicators. You know, all of us want to be effective. You know, when we sit down with people, we want to kind of make sure that we're doing things that work. Except, it's kind of like with dignity or person-centered care. What usually happens is, we just kind of trust our gut. And not everybody has a talented gut. And so it is funny, isn't it? So we need then something that is kind of more disentangled, understand the elements so that you can then kind of understand the entirety. Okay, how do I approach a task like optimal therapeutic communication? So again, I'm going to skip through these next couple of slides just because they're kind of boring and they're sort of the methodologies, but trust me, we saw lots of people. All of these folks were experts in, as it happens, psychosocial oncology, so lots of social workers, pastoral care folks, psychology counselors, healthcare professionals of various kinds, nursing. We did a huge number of focus groups across the country. This slide demonstrates that all of these folks have lots and lots of experience. And what we were asking them is, how do you communicate effectively in the work that you do? How do you communicate effectively with the people that you see? What are the elements of optimal therapeutic communication? And before I jump into the details, I can say at the end of the day, when we presented this final model, 83% said, not only has this model increased my understanding of how to even be a better communicator, but 95% said, you know what? If I have to go out and teach this, this is the tool that I'll be using. So let me kind of give you a sense of what this looks like. And again, if some of this feels like, I think he's talking a lot, but he's going kind of fast, all of the papers are in the public domain. They're all open access, so you don't have to pay anything to get any of them. I have a website called dignityandcare.ca. You can go there, and I think we haven't updated it as recently as we should have, but try and keep a repository of articles that are there, and again, they're all free. You can go to PubMed, and again, you'll find all of my articles. Just if you type in Chochinov, they're all there, and again, can be uploaded at no cost. And this was an article on healthcare provider communication, and I think in your handout you have the, oh no, you don't have the cover. Anyways, but you have the reference there. Yeah, you have the reference at the bottom of this is the reference. Okay, so the surface dissection. First of all, there was what we called the therapeutic approach. And what this basically means is, what is your chartable activity? In other words, why are you in the room in the first place? What is it that you need to achieve? So, am I going in to do a family history? Am I going in to disclose a diagnosis or a test result? What is my task? Because if you don't have a specific task or any task whatsoever, it's hard to get somewhere if you really don't know, where you're going or where you intend to go. So that was one thing that was identified by our cohort, as having a therapeutic task, an identifiable task, was important in order to be optimally effective. The next thing was this idea of creating a safe space. And this had to do with privacy, confidentiality, and kind of the therapeutic milieu. And, it doesn't matter where you're thinking about, a delicate conversation in which you're trying to elicit information about this person's, maybe their history, their coping, their family, or you're doing something, like a physical examination. You can do an exquisite job of either of those things, but in the absence of a safe space, if the door is ajar, if you're not creating an element of confidentiality and privacy in an appropriate milieu, you will fail. It will not work. And even if you pull it off, the patient will feel somehow kind of emotionally assaulted by the experience. And then the final surface dissection was, you need both of those, but you also need to bring what we called an element of personal growth and self-care, which has to do with you. So bringing yourself into the encounter in a way that allows you some insight into the pathos of what is going on. So I remember we were conducting this study, and one day one of the social workers arrived late for a session, and just out of curiosity and also thinking, well, maybe there's a teaching point that can be made here. I said, so, what was going on today? And she said, well, I had to go to the ward. I was meeting a patient. I had to kind of take him to my office, which is, on the ward, to sign a disability form. And so I said, well, okay, so the task was getting the signature. And, you were taking him off to an office to accomplish that task. I said, but anybody could have done that. You could have just phoned in and say, listen, Chachnov has one of his focus groups now. I can't make it. Get somebody to sign the form, to have him sign the form. The ward clerk, the medical student, whomever. And she said, well, no, that wouldn't have been appropriate. And I said, well, and why is that? She said, well, this is a person that she'd been working with for a long period of time. Signing this form represented the fact that he would no longer be able to viably be employed. He would no longer be able to be the breadwinner in his family. And being able to look at him in the eye, whether it's the look, the hand on the shoulder, just to impart that there is this kind of existential happening here in the moment, recognizing the pathos of this moment, that made it optimally therapeutically effective. And again, in medicine, it seems to me that we're very good when it comes to the transactional. Get the signature, get the test, get the DNR, whatever the transactional element is. It's a process, but people don't like to feel processed. It's missing the relational. And so this says that the relational is important. So identify your task, make sure that you have an element of a safe therapeutic setting, and finally, bring in an element of self that will allow you to recognize personhood and the pathos of what's unfolding. So that is the surface dissection of the anatomical task of disassembling elements of therapeutic effectiveness. Now, what we discovered as we were going through this, however, is that there were some codes that we had come up with that didn't seem to land squarely in one of those first three. They seemed to sort of land at the interface between two of them. So between a therapeutic approach, identifying your approach, and creating safety was this other theme that we called therapeutic pacing. In other words, the task in the moment became to either slow down or speed up, do something with the emotional engagement in the here and now. So let me illustrate that with, again, another case example that unfolded during the course of doing these workshops. One of the social workers said she had been called down to the oncology clinic to see a patient who was in crisis. As it turns out, this woman had just been told something about her disease trajectory. She thought she was on a certain course. That course, I guess, was more of a curative or protracted course. And that morning, some information was disclosed that said, no, you're on a different path, and that path is dangerous and brief and scary. And so the social worker walked into the room. This woman was actually on the floor, crying. And what the social worker said she did is she sat down on the floor, put her hand on her shoulder, and said, all you need to do is breathe. That's it. So the therapeutic task was about slowing down the pace, saying, and so when I think about this domain of therapeutic pacing, I think of this as kind of the communication accelerator or decelerator. Is this a time for deeper emotional engagement? So what was it like hearing that from him? So what are your thoughts? Where did that take you to? That's sort of more of an emotionally kind of engaging, confronting, let's uncover, which is not what's required in the moment. What's required in the moment is pulling back on that accelerator. In fact, slowing things down, saying, There is nothing we need to talk about. There's nothing we need to do other than just be here together and for you to breathe, okay? So that is the element of therapeutic pacing. It's when the task becomes controlling the pacing of it to keep this environment safe. Yes?
Isn't that also creating a safe space?
That's exactly it. So pacing lies between what is my task and how do I create safety? And it's saying the only task is to slow down the pacing so that you are creating a safe space. Absolutely, that's exactly the point. Next, we discovered that between a safe space and this issue of personal growth, there was this category, and again in the photograph you can see how they overlap better and more elegantly than when I just lay them out here in words, is something called therapeutic presence. So this is to say that by bringing an element of who you are into the encounter, you are creating a safe space. So bringing yourself as the instrument of creating that safety. And again, all of us have likely experienced this, either when we are doing this work or when we've been on the receiving end of healthcare. I remember a colleague of mine who, this was a wonderful medical oncologist, and she would walk in the room and there was just kind of a calmness about her. And it wasn't, think about tone of care. It wasn't about what she was saying or doing. It was just a way of her being. And the handout that you have that shows you the model give you a number of elements that are subsumed under this issue of therapeutic presence, like not being distracted, being empathic, being non-judgmental, being fully there. And so that is the next element that you need to understand in order to be optimally therapeutically effective. That the person you bring into that room, your presence, your tone of care has a profound influence. And then the very last thing, the very last kind of subcategory that we found is that sometimes the only task you can bring to bear has to do with who you are and the way you are in that space. And we called this therapeutic humility. And kind of the prototype for this, and when I think about therapeutic humility, and I'll be talking about it more in my next talk, is this idea of yielding the notion of fixing. Therapeutic humility is when there isn't a readily available fix, but showing up. Recently, and I think you actually have this on your one-page handout, I was asked by the Dean of Medicine to deliver the white coat ceremony speech. I don't know if you have those here, but the white coat ceremony is when the new class of medical students come in and you give them a talk that sort of sets them on their way. So this is the class of 2028. And one of the things, and you have a link for that if you want to listen to it. Instead of listening to me talk a whole day, in 12 minutes, I think you can probably get kind of a Reader's Digest abbreviated version of Chachanov, et al. What I say to them is that aspire to be more than human body mechanics. Aspire to be healers. And to be a healer means, you're not expected to fix what can't be fixed or to cure what can't be cured, but you're expected to show up. And this is what therapeutic humility is about. It's about showing up in the absence of, in fact, even knowing that you don't have a fix. And the prototype is really, where somebody is imminently dying, or maybe somebody has just died. And you have a choice of either walking into that space knowing that you don't have the cure, you don't have something that can take away that kind of sorrow, but you do have the ability to be present. And we'll be talking a whole lot more about what does it mean to be humble, to have therapeutic humility, and how critical it is to show up. So I think with that, and this is just a reminder of our journey and the journey we're all I think with that, even though we're a few minutes early, I am going to kind of wind this first talk down. This is my contact information. Probably easiest email. If you said, I couldn't find an article and you mentioned it, and I'd like to get hold of it, I can send you a PDF. As well, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I promise you, I just use those for professional purposes. I will not be posting what I had for breakfast or, that's the kind of crazy things that people post on social media. The only thing that I'll post on there is, maybe where I gave a talk, or if I had a paper that's come out that people might be interested in. And this is a photograph from my hometown. This is a photograph on the skyline of Winnipeg. And if you haven't been to Winnipeg lately, and I can tell you, just having made the trip yesterday from Winnipeg here, it's an easy trip. This is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. And it's the first museum, national museum, to be located outside of our capital city, Ottawa. And it's as spectacular inside as it is on the outside. So with that, why don't I stop slide sharing, if I can figure out how to do that, so that people can see me if they're online and not have to look at the slide. Oh, 1 minute. This is so funny. I'm thinking, I'm on Zoom. How do I stop sharing my slides? I'm not on Zoom. You're all out there. I'm not looking at a little screen here. You're all. So forget about all that. I don't have to shut down Zoom. I'm here. You're here. Okay. So thoughts, questions, reflections, and I think we have a half hour for this, and I think Kelly and Diane are going to kind of help monitor the room. There are microphones, and there are also people online who maybe have been asking questions, maybe just for the sake of the group and their curiosity and mine. How many people are online? Do we know? 65. Oh my goodness. Suddenly the room feels, like this is like a crowded space. We're sharing this with a lot of people. Okay, so we've got a nice leisurely amount of time for Q&A. And if there's not a particular question, even just, share a reflection. How does this jive with, what you're doing, with your work? What will enable that? Anything at all. And the other thing I'll say is that I'm a psychiatrist and I'm very comfortable with silence. Okay. Yes, we have somebody here. If you could bring them. If you can just say, who you are, your name and your connection with palliative care, end-of-life care.
Yeah, my name is Rachel Hike.
I'm sorry, your name is?
My name is Rachel, and I am a community-based palliative care social worker. Earlier you had a study, and I haven't been able to flip back fast enough, but I'm wondering how you tease out, and if it's even necessary to, a lot of patients have already feel like they have a loss of dignity, society's response, and lack of purpose and meaning in just aging in general, whether they're at end of life or not.
Yep.
And so I guess I'm just wondering, how that interplays in all of this.
Okay. I guess first off, by the way, I would say that being named Rachel immediately elicits feelings of kind of affection and connection. My daughter's name is Rachel. So how do you spell Rachel?
Rachel.
Okay, well, I don't feel as close anymore. I'm the father of Rachel. Listen, we all make decisions. We all go through life in different ways. I guess the first thing I would say about it is that it is relevant and it's salient to everyone, right? So that, because some people, I remember I gave a talk recently and somebody said, well, how do I know which patients I should be focusing in on to make sure that I do this kind of dignity work? And what I say, well, focus on the ones that have a pulse, because, all human beings have a need to and again, getting back to this idea of kind of affirmation, to feel affirmed, to feel that they are valued, and to feel that they are being seen. Again, there's this kind of great irony in that we all spend the entirety of our profession learning how to look after patients, and at the end of the day, you really piss people off when you treat them, just like a patient. Because what does it mean to be a patient? A patient is a generic term. We understand, a breast cancer patient, a lung cancer patient, COPD, you name it. But nobody likes to be kind of defined that way, because it means that they are being defined on the basis of their illness. And by the way, I tell all my students, and whether clinically or when they're writing, the idea of referring to somebody as breast cancer patient or schizophrenic, I say, no, you have to get rid of that vocabulary entirely. It is a patient with breast cancer, a patient with schizophrenia, because first and foremost they are who they are, not their illness. The other point you're making, though, is that there are some people who come at this with kind of this, I don't want to say baggage, but they have assembled things during the course of their experience that have been challenging and assaultive to their sense of dignity. I think, again, we need to be even more kind of hyper-vigilant and exquisitely kind of attentive to that. And I think, and in my next talk, I think I'll talk about this, we need to employ ways of even questioning our own lens, because there are a lot of attitudes that end up being kind of ingrained in a way that certain things, certain people, certain experiences are sadly less valued and given less time than others. When I was going through medical school, and this goes back a long time, I remember Joel's a little bit younger than me, so maybe medical school had changed by the time he was going through it. But I remember that when we were on doing medicine, the attending would take us on rounds, and at the end of those rounds, the people who did not have any cure available to them, they had all been made what we call non-teaching, which meant we didn't see them routinely on rounds unless there was time at the end of that day to go and spend a few minutes with them, which is completely wonky, right? It's completely wonky because it says the only thing that's important is the transactional. The relational has no real meaning. So if I can't go there and write a script, or I can't, order a scan, then really what's the point? Well, the point is, and this is a title from an article that I published years ago, and it's called "The Secret Is Out: Patients are people with feelings that matter." Well, I know, stupid title, right? But it kind of nails it. It's like patients are people with feelings that matter. So we are going to be talking a little bit more about what happens around like ageism, mental illness, the people who come at this already with assaults, long-standing assaults to personal dignity that precede illness experience. So that's the beginning of my answer, Rachel with an A-E-L, but not the entirety of it. We'll kind of follow it up in the next talk. Great. Not all at once. It's overwhelming.
We have a question from an online participant. Are therapeutic approach and therapeutic task interchangeable?
For the purposes of that model, they are. And if I had to redo, you put it out there, you sort of do the best that you can at the time. Even today, when I, read that particular label and it says, therapeutic approach, to me, therapeutic approach wasn't necessarily the best term, because it doesn't, it seems to imply a particular type of intervention as opposed to just identifying what is to be done. So the answer is yes, and if I had to and had the opportunity to put second edition, that's the nice thing about books, is you can write a second edition and kind of fix those things up. But you can't do that with articles. So for the purposes of the answer, yes, they are. Yes.
My name is Lee Erickson. I'm a grief and trauma therapist. So I've been looking at your talk kind of through the lens of working with people who have serious depression. And I'm curious, I'm in a consult group where we talk about this idea of, is depression sometimes terminal? Is a mental health diagnosis sometimes terminal for people? So I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of how we treat folks with serious mental illness who also may be at the end of their lives versus people who have physical ailments that might be at the end of their lives.
It's a complex and fraught question. And one, by the way, that is playing out in Canada in ways that are really quite extraordinary. And again, I'm not going to kind of derail the talk, and I'm trying to avoid the question at all, but just kind of telling you things that kind of come up for me as I reflect on your question. All of you know that Canada now has legislation for medical assistance in dying. And that legislation came in 2016, and people who had a grievous, irremediable condition, at least initially the legislation read with reasonably foreseeable death, could avail themselves of this option. That has been a really interesting, difficult, but evolving story because eventually the legislation was challenged, and the constitutionality of the legislation was challenged. And then some people say, well, listen, just because I am not imminently dying, if I'm suffering, why am I at a disadvantage to somebody who, their death would come, quickly. My death will not come quickly, but so why is it that I can live with a chronic illness or disability and not have access to assisted death? And the court, in its wisdom, whether you think it was wise or not wise, again, we're not going to get into the politics of it, but the court decided, you know what, they're right, and changed the legislation. And so in Canada, there are now two tracks. Track one MAID is for patients who do have a reasonably foreseeable death. Track 2 MAID is for people who have a chronic medical condition or disability that will not necessarily have a reasonably foreseeable death. So those are both currently available and legal in Canada. Now getting to your question, some people looked at this and said, well, you know what, suffering is suffering. And there's no debate here whether suffering derives from physical origins or from psychiatric or psychological origins. Mental suffering, physical suffering, these things are shoulder to shoulder in kind of undermining, sapping us of the vitality of what it means to be alive. And so, and actually, this debate took place not so much in the courts, but in the Houses of Parliament, where, and one of the proponents of this was one of in our Senate, where they said, you know what, before we approve of Track 2 legislation, we think that we need to think about people who are grappling with mental illness. That some people are just so burdened by mental illness that it ought to be legal in Canada. That's what the Senate suggested. They're a non-elected body, but the politicians who are elected said, geez, that sounds kind of scary. We hear you, but, and yes, let's do it, but not quite yet. So they put in a sunset clause. In other words, we'll have a period of time to let the whole country kind of grapple with this, let everybody kind of figure out how to make this happen for patients who are mentally ill. And I can tell you that I spoke to lots of department heads of psychiatry who are just freaking out. What are we going to do? We've got this legislation is coming down the pike. And when was that pike coming to fruition? Last March. So last March, we came to the brink of introducing legislation that would say, if you're mentally ill, you don't have to have a physical illness causing that. If you're mentally ill and feel that you now have a grievous, irremediable medical condition, suffering that can't be fixed by any means that are suitable to you, which is another aspect of, a unique aspect of the Canadian legislation, you meet eligibility criteria. At the last moment, the government backed away from it and said, you know what, we can't do it. The government backed away from it, though, for a few reasons, just besides being scared, which is, reason to kind of be cautious. We're talking about people's lives here, after all. The reasons they also backed away from it were that the experts were saying a few things that gave them pause. First of all, what they were saying is that we can't really tell the difference, and this is coming from psychiatrists and mental health care professionals, saying we can't really tell the difference between suicidality and a bona fide request for medical aid in dying in somebody who has a chronic mental illness. How do you tell those things apart? And the truth is that there aren't good differentiators. So that's the first thing, because, I had lots of colleagues saying, geez, I've got patients who've been suicidal for years, and now they're telling me, okay, don't worry about it, doc. We'll sort it out. When March comes, I know what I'm gonna do. So that was the first thing, is that we can't differentiate them. The second thing was we can't predict irremediability. So the fact is that, if you've got, an end-stage malignancy, stage 4, widely metastatic, the chances that you are going to die are pretty high. Do miracles occur? The frequency of cure in those instances is minuscule, compared to the fact that people, even after years of mental illness, do get better, can get better. But the point that I think paused Parliament from moving forward with this was the fact that studies have shown that the prediction of irremediability in patients with chronic mental illness in the hands of mental health professionals is no better than chance alone. So there have been studies, in fact it was actually less than 50%, that psychiatrists were able to predict with certainty which patients would or would not get better. So just to summarize then, there's no argument. Suffering is suffering. Mental illness is exquisitely horrific, shoulder to shoulder with physical, somatic suffering. That is not the contentious, debated issue. The debated issues is that until we can differentiate who's trying to commit suicide versus who has a bona fide request for medical aid in dying, and how can we know that the person that we are enabling in assisted death isn't one of those people who is going to recover? And I can tell you that some of the people who testified before a parliamentary committee on this, before they made their decision, were saying, I am somebody who has suffered from mental illness. And the truth is, had this option been available to me, I would not be here today to give testimony. Yes, we have a microphone here. We haven't had a bathroom break, you haven't had any nutrition. Is everybody still kind of intellectually on the edge of your seat and comfortably so?
See, I'm comfortable saving this for later.
No. We are scheduled to 10:30. We're scheduled to 10:30, so bring it on. Bring it on, absolutely.
I'm a retired emeritus family therapist, social worker. Here, just out of interest, I have a thought and a comment and a question. My mother, from the age of 92 to 93, several years ago, was in assisted living when COVID hit. She was virtually kept in a room by herself for a year. Several of the people around her passed without seeing any family. I was persistent. I went down, talked through the window. I was on the phone with her twice a day that whole year.
I take it that photograph resonated.
Yeah, I finally went down there and oddly talked to the administrator who had a video game on his computer. and took her out of there. Put her in a house with my sister, paid for it for the last 5 months of her life, thankfully. So I got to see her and hang out with her. I don't hear about anything being talked about preventative of how badly the American health system handled that situation with the elderly. And I'm wondering if you know of anything in Canada, or how they handled that, or if there's been anything talked about to not ever allow that to happen again to older people who had to pass in isolation virtually.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that story. I should say, by the way, again, I mean, your story reminded me of Joyce, who I told you about. The day before she died, we did get called from the personal care home to say, they said, we think that this is imminent. And so the last 24 hours, we were actually able to go down there. I mean, full, guard, PPE, and spend that day with her. And, I'm just so grateful for that. I mean, even now, I just sort of feel, kind of quivery when I think about that whole kind of horrific nightmare, and how much worse it would have been had we not had that final time with her. So I'm grateful for that. But I've seen lots of people, lots of families who didn't have that experience. We conducted a group of studies during the course of COVID looking at experiences of death and dying for patients, for families, and healthcare providers. And those studies are now all coming out and being published, talking about the detailed experiences of patients, families, and healthcare providers, and how it was influenced by the pandemic. I can't say anything informally about the American healthcare system. I mean, I've listened to people like Dr. Fauci, people like Peter Hotez, who's just extraordinary, and talking about the number of Americans who died, and the number of Americans who probably died unnecessarily because of the avoidance of vaccinations. I don't know the American experience as far as the elderly and people who are in personal care homes or assisted living. I can say that in Canada, it was not a good scene. I mean, there was by far hugely disproportionate number of deaths of people who were in personal care homes. I mean, some places were just decimated. It was horrific. What do we learn from that? Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, we certainly learn, that these things that we take for granted, being present, use the word hanging out, being present, hanging out, spending time with, the things that just seem so intuitive and natural and obvious. When you take those away, it turns out that those are the things that really undermine, quality of life and what, kind of that end experience looks like. The other thing that you learn is that some of this, represented a lack of kind of prospective, anticipatory investment in, the strength of that healthcare system. So, if you don't invest in care for the elderly, if you don't provide the infrastructure, and then you have this, global cataclysmic, crisis, who were the first to go? The people that didn't have enough investment in their care. So, and that's exactly what played out. So, so the lessons to be learned in terms of how do you prevent this? Well, I don't know how you prevent another global crisis around things like contagion. When I listen to the experts, you kind of get the sense that it's not a matter of will it happen again, but when it happens again. But what can we do in terms of preparedness? And certainly, part of that preparedness is trying to make sure that we invest adequately in people who are most vulnerable. Not when crisis hits, but now, so that when crisis does hit, that we're in a better position to be able to offer care and meet needs. Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you for what you've shared so far. My name is Ted Bowman. I'm a grief and family educator. My question has to do with the dignity of family caregivers. You've talked about the therapeutic team, you've talked about the person as patient and their dignity, but I think I remember in a caregiver group where a daughter was caring for her mother and was just found it offensive to have to wipe her mother's bottom, to do some of those kinds of chores, and it was getting in the way of her dignity and the dignity of her mother. Shared that with a group of neighbors, and there were a group of women who would come in the evening and wipe the mother's bottom so the daughter would not have to do it. Are you going to address, as the day goes on, the dignity of family caregivers?
Yeah, I think I am going to touch on it, but now that you've raised it, let me just sort of share a couple of comments. One is that what we have found in our studies are the things that affect the dignity of the patient. And your case example kind of points this out. The things that affect the dignity of the patient also affect the dignity of the family. The fact is that and whether it's something as that feels as personally assaultive to that person as having to attend or help with intimacies of care, or feeling that somehow that person is not being recognized and treated as a whole person, as opposed to feels like they are just another patient. That everything that happens with them is transactional. That undermines the sense of dignity of the family member, because they feel, this is my mother, this is my family member, this is not just an individual with A, B, and C in terms of differential diagnosis or problem checklist. So that's a critical piece. When we attend to the dignity of the patient, we are also attending to the dignity of the family member. And in palliative care, as it happens, the unit of care is the patient and the family, and that's one instance where those two things play out very much hand in hand. The other thing, and I don't think I'm going to be talking about this too much when I give my next talk, but I've introduced something into the literature that we call, or I have coined, intensive caring. And I'll be talking more about, what does that mean? But a corollary paper that I published is directed at family members. And reminding family, in fact it's called intensive caring, reminding family that they matter. And it's in the journal of, I think it's in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. If you can't locate it, write me and I'll send you the PDF. But basically, family have a really important and difficult task. And oftentimes it's even more difficult than, well, I'd say it is more difficult than the healthcare provider. The healthcare provider has the comfort of being able to pick up a chart, being able to kind of flip through, and even do something that creates the illusion that they're doing something important. You adjust something here, you write a note, whatever. The family doesn't have that privilege. And so, oftentimes, I hear them talking about kind of a sense of kind of helplessness, a feeling that, like, well, what's the point? And the anecdote that comes in mind is this is actually a family friend, and this gentleman, he's a good friend of my father, who's now 94, living in assisted living. And his friend came to me one day and he says, Harvey, I just feel terrible. I said, well, what's going on, Len? And he said, well, he goes to the personal care home where his wife is living with advanced dementia. He says, I go there, I sit, we hold hands, and to tell you the truth, sometimes, all we do is we just fall asleep in front of the TV. And I said, well then, is there anyone in the universe who can hold your wife's hand, maybe fleetingly remind her that she's the person who is the center of your universe and your family's universe, and just be with her in that way? I said, there's nobody else who can do that. It doesn't matter who, you can throw money at the problem, you can hire a healthcare aide, but the truth is then, when you say all you do is just go and be, it says, what you need to do is get rid of the word just. There is no just in what you're doing is profound and extraordinary and not replicable. And again, that's something that COVID taught us. You know, you remove the family, everything fell apart. You know, the healthcare folks, I mean, they're all struggling with burnout. You know, the patients are dying. You know, in the personal care homes, you know, a huge number of deaths. And what is the common denominator? You remove the critical element of family is present, to be there, to advocate. So I think we need to, when we talk about families and family care providers, we need to get rid of this word just, you know, that they see their task as somehow just, you know, to show up. Showing up is profound, and like I say, it's irreplicable. Nobody else can do what they do the way they do it. I think we have time for maybe one more.
I have a comment from an online participant.
Is it a nice comment? Because it's going to be the final comment before our break.
It's not about you.
Oh. I deserve that. That was fair. It's not about you.
I let families visit COVID patients, where'd it go? More than I was supposed to because of the pain to the hearts of the care. Why did this go out? Okay. All right, I'm going to start again.
No worries.
I let families visit COVID patients more than I was supposed to because of the pain of the hearts of us caregiving, and as much as the pain to families and patients. It was the right thing to do.
Thank you for that. There's a paper that came out in the journal Death Studies. I think it was previously, I think the journal was, is it previously called Thanatology? I can't, for those of you who, anyways, about healthcare providers and healthcare provider experience. And I'd encourage any of you who are interested, you know, to pull that article out of Death Studies on the experience of healthcare providers and exactly the experience that you're reporting. You know, like, I mean, how much do you kind of follow the rules versus bending the rules in a way that are going to kind of accommodate the needs of the family without jeopardizing, you know, kind of public health concerns about limiting spread of contagion and all those sorts of things. So if you're interested in kind of a deep dive into healthcare provider experience, you may want to, you know, take a look at that paper. All right, you've all been very patient and attentive. I think we have 15 minutes to kind of stretch and eat and do whatever we need to do to make us comfortable. And then I'll see you back here at 1:45. Thank you.